If you spend any time looking for a paddle recently, you'll know that there's well over 100 and some paddles out there. There's different manufacturers, there's different types of paddles, thick core, thin cores, different types of cores, different types of faces on them, edge, no edge, different grip sizes and things like that. So what we thought we would do is we put together in this video for you, what we believe are the most important characteristics that you should look for in a paddle, and also mention some of the things that perhaps aren't as important in selecting a paddle. So that's what we're going to do in this video. Let me kick the video off with the single most important criteria for you in selecting a pickleball paddle. You don't want to be late getting up to the kitchen. You also don't want to be late in seeing one of our new videos. Subscribe below to make sure you're the first one in your group to know the latest In2Pickle strategy. Single most important criteria in selecting a pickleball paddle is you. What you need to think about is you need to think about what type of player are you? Are you a control player or a power player? Are you a type of person that likes to or can hold weight in your hand for a long amount of time? A lot of times when we play pickleball, we're out there for 2-3 hours at a time. So, and you're holding the paddle for a good chunk of that time. So are you someone who can handle weight in your hand and are comfortable with having weight in your hand? Do you need a longer grip because you use a two-handed backhand? Do you need a smaller grip circumference because you have a small hand? And we believe just as importantly, do you like the paddle? We think it's really important that you actually like the paddle that you're playing with, both in terms of how it feels while you play and just do you enjoy pulling it out of the bag when you play with it. We think that's a criteria that's often overlooked by players and something that you should think about when you buy a paddle. Let me first share with you some of the things that we do not recommend for most players with a paddle. The first thing we do not recommend for most players with a paddle is we don't recommend odd-shaped paddles, so long paddles or odd-shaped paddles. We recommend a basic-shaped paddle, which is this kind of a paddle, basic shape like this, traditional shape, if you will. This is the type of paddle that we recommend for most players. This type of paddle will provide you the most balance in terms of playability, being able to use it for defense and offense. It'll give you a nice sweet spot. Generally won't be head heavy because of the shape of it. So for most players, unless you're getting into singles or something like that where you might need a little more reach, a little more power on your shot that a longer paddle will give you, we recommend sticking with a traditional shape paddle. In terms of materials, unless you're just curious about it and want to know more about it, we don't think there's a huge difference between different types of paddles in terms of playability. So obviously a carbon paddle and a honeycomb paddle are going to be differently constructed, and you may prefer one versus the other in terms of how it plays for you. But once you get into that type of a paddle, we think that focusing too much on the exact material that you're getting, whether it's the fiberglass or graphite on the face or a honeycomb or carbon inside, isn't really where you want to be. Where you want to be focusing on is on how do you like the paddle, how it plays. There are two substances or two materials that we don't recommend. One is wood, and it's not because of anything particularly wrong with wood. In fact, we obviously understand the historical significance of wood to the game because the first paddles were wood paddles, and for a number of years people used wood paddles to play pickleball, which is perfectly fine. The problem with the wood paddle is the weight. You can't really find a wood paddle under 10 ounces. What ends up happening is when you're playing with a heavy paddle like that, 2 more ounces or an additional 25% of weight, if you look at it that way, from an 8-ounce paddle, it can be significant as you play the game. And the other thing is that wood paddles don't generally have the playability of the other cores, honeycomb, carbon, or some of the other cores out there. So we don't recommend wood paddles. Another material that we shy away from is Nomex, N-O-M-E-X. It has been a material that has been used historically in pickleball, and there's nothing wrong with that. But given the materials that are out there available today, the issue with Nomex for us is that it's a little bit harsh on the arm. It's a tremendously powerful material. If you hit a ball with a Nomex paddle, you'll know it. I mean, the ball will zing off that paddle. But the harshness on the arm, we think that the other materials are just better suited for most players' games. Once you get past the sort of general recommendations or things that we don't recommend, what you want to look at next is there's a couple of things that might be disqualifiers for you in terms of certain paddles. One thing that can be important is grip length. So like if you have a two-handed backhand, you're going to need a longer grip length, or if you like moving your hand around. So like if you were to compare these two paddles here, for instance, what you're going to see is these two paddles here. What you'll see is a difference in the grip length. So if I hold them basically butt to butt, if you will, or bottom to bottom like that, you can see that the back paddle here, the orange grip, is shorter than the gray grip. So if I was going to use a two-handed backhand, it'd be very difficult with this paddle. This paddle gives me a longer grip. Now, this paddle, this grip length, which is a pretty normal, longer grip length, isn't an extended grip length. There's other paddles that have grip lengths that come up to about here. So, you know, if you really want a longer grip length, then look for a longer, even longer than that one. But the grip length is one of those things that you really want to be conscientious of or careful of when you buy a paddle. If you have a two-handed grip, you want to make sure that you get a paddle that you can play with and not a paddle that you can't play the game you want to play with. The other thing on grip that might be, could be a disqualifier is grip size or circumference. So be careful with that, particularly if you have really small hands. You may want to look for a company that can do a custom grip for you. They can make a really small grip. Usually there's a little bit of surcharge, but it's well worth it if, obviously, so you can hold on to the grip. So those are a couple of disqualifiers that might lead you lead you away from certain paddles based on grip size. Another characteristic of a paddle that might disqualify one is if you plan on playing tournaments or sanctioned play, you're going to want a paddle that's USAPA approved. The paddles, generally most paddles will say on there USAPA approved. If you're not sure, you can go to the USAPA website, and I'll link to that below. They have a site where basically you can check the paddle list of what's approved by the USAPA. While it's perfectly fine to use a non-USAPA approved paddle for general play, you're welcome to do so. If you ever play in a sanctioned tournament, you won't be able to use a paddle unless it's USAPA approved. Once you've gotten past the sort of disqualified paddles, so paddles that aren't recommended general or for you specifically because of grip and things like that, now you need to make a decision among the remaining paddles, which is still going to be a significant number of paddles. So what should you look for? The single most important characteristic of the paddle at the end of the day will be how it plays for you. In other words, a paddle that plays well for me may not play well for you, and vice versa. You need to find a paddle that'll play well for you. What we're going to do here is give you a couple of more tips in terms of specific things that you should look for, think about when you're thinking about a paddle that you want to buy or that you want to try out. One of the most important factors you should look for in a paddle is its weight. And by weight, I'm not referring to the total weight of the paddle, I'm referring to swing weight. The difference is total weight of the paddle is just if you take the paddle and put it on a scale, it weighs some number of ounces. Swing weight means how does it feel when you swing it through the air. So you could have two paddles, for instance, that are both 8-ounce paddles. Obviously, their actual weight is the same for each of them, so that their weight on the scale is the same. But their swing weight could be very different. There's some paddles that you're going to swing through the air, and they'll feel like nothing, like a feather going through the air. And you take another paddle, the same exact weight as the first paddle, you'll swing it through the air, and it'll feel like you're dragging it through water. So when you feel that kind of dragging it through water, like you're dragging a weight at the end of it, that's what we call a head-heavy paddle. That's a paddle that have greater swing weight. So what you want to do is you want to be conscientious of that. There are reasons to get a paddle with more swing weight or higher swing weight or head heavier. Now, for instance, if you want more power, if you want to be able to plow through the ball better, the heavier the head of the paddle is, the more energy will be transmitted into the ball. If you want a paddle that'll whip around quicker, that you'll be able to get from right to left or left to right quicker as you defend, then you're going to want a head neutral or a head lighter paddle than the other paddle. So that's something to be really conscientious of, and it factors into the next thing that you want to consider, which is are you looking for a power paddle, a control paddle, or a balance paddle? Some players have the ability to generate plenty of power on their own because of their physique. So they might favor a control paddle because they can provide their own power. So they might look for a paddle that gives them a little more touch, a little more control, softens the ball a little bit more so that they're not overpowering every point and they have more control over the situation. And there's other players who may want a paddle that generates a little more power for them so that when they get ready to put the ball away, they can do so. But each one of those has a little bit of a trade-off normally. Like your control paddles will generally not give you as much power as your power paddles and vice versa. You can also go for a neutral paddle or a balance paddle. Gives you a little bit of each. So if you're not sure, I would recommend a neutral paddle. If let's say you came from a tennis background and you used to swinging a big racket and things like that, you could maybe go towards a more power paddle because you're going to be used to swinging weight. If you already generate enough power and you're ambivalent about having either one, then maybe look at a control paddle as an option because that'll help round out your game. So once you've established that it's not a trouble material like wood or Nomex would be, and the weight's good, the grip is good, and it otherwise fits your criteria budget-wise and things like that, then I would recommend finding a paddle that you just like. In other words, finding a paddle that calls out to you, if you will. You know, whether it's the graphics or the shape or the manufacturer or whatever it is. You know, so once you've made once you've gone through the first steps, the last step really is make sure that it's something that you're going to enjoy, both pulling out of your bag and then holding in your hand for 2-3 hours, or, you know, if you're at a rec center, having somebody hold it up and call your name when they hold it up, that kind of thing. I think that's an important part of it. So, you know, go through the first part, figure everything out, and then once you've whittled it down, I would go with a paddle that just makes you happy to have and to pull out of your bag. We're going to dive deeper into topics like swing weight, and we're going to talk about the different shapes of paddles and why we recommend the traditional shape. We'll talk some more about grips and things like that in some other videos. But the factors that we've talked about in this video should give you a pretty good head start in terms of looking at what's out there, what's available, and being able to make hopefully a more informed decision about what the best paddle is. At the end of the day, though, the most important thing is that the paddle is right for you. Good luck out there.